I still remember the way the air felt that night, sharp enough to sting my lungs, heavy enough to make my heart feel twice its size. It was Christmas Eve in Bloomington, Indiana, the first one without my mom. And I kept telling myself that showing up for dinner was the right thing to do. I thought maybe being together would help us all feel a little less hollow. I was 32 years old, trying to hold myself together with the same shaky patience I used as a kid, whenever my family started fracturing around me. Before I tell you how everything fell apart, I am curious, what are you doing while listening to this story? For me, when all of this happened, I was standing in my childhood kitchen, carrying a dish my mom used to make. Hope it might soften the tension that had been building since I walked in the door. I barely got my coat off before I felt the cold wall between us. My dad, Richard, already smelled like the bourbon he swore he gave up years ago. He stood near the living room window, staring into the yard as if he was waiting for someone better to show up. My older sister, Lydia, looked me over the way she always did, with that half-disguised smirk that made me feel 12 years old again. "You made it," she said, not sounding the least bit pleased. I ignored the tone, the way I learned to over the years, and carried the casserole dish into the dining room. The whole house felt off, like all the warm light had gone with my mom when she passed away 3 months earlier. I heard her voice in everything, especially the silence. I set the dish on the table and smoothed out my sleeves, trying to steady myself. Dinner began without much talking. Forks on plates, the clink of glasses, an occasional sigh from my dad. I kept thinking about Mom's little traditions, how she would go around the table asking each of us for one thing we were grateful for. No one mentioned her. No one even tried. Halfway through the meal, I found myself talking about her anyway, softly, mostly to fill the emptiness. I said how she used to hum while she cooked, how she always added extra nutmeg because she said it made everything feel warmer. I knew the moment the words left my mouth that I should not have said anything. My dad's jaw tightened. Lydia rolled her eyes hard enough to pull the whole room with her. Dad dropped his fork, leaned back, and stared at me like I was the reason grief existed in this world. Then he stood up, unsteady but sharp. He pointed straight at me, and in front of everyone, he said that the greatest gift for me is your disappearance. The room froze. The lights seemed to hum louder. My breath caught in my throat. He said it again, even slower this time, as if he wanted the words to carve themselves into me. Before I could even react, Lydia stepped forward, arms crossed the way she always stood when she was ready to hurt me. She looked right into my face and said, "Hope you enjoy being homeless, because I made sure you get nothing." Every part of me wanted to believe I misheard her, but the small, satisfied curl at the edge of her mouth told me I had not. No one defended me. No one asked them to stop. Chair did not scrape back in protest. It was like the whole room agreed silently that I was the problem. I felt myself shrink and harden at the same time. So this was who they had become without Mom to hold us together. Or maybe this was who they had always been. And Mom had been the only reason. The truth stayed buried. I placed my napkin on the table and stood. My legs shook, but I kept walking. Not one hand reached out to stop me as I left the dining room. Not one word of apology followed me down the hall. I grabbed my coat, feeling the blood rushing in my ears, the humiliation and shock making everything tilt around me. When I stepped out onto the front porch, snowflakes smacked my cheeks, melting under the heat of my skin. The sky was this deep winter blue, the kind that makes the whole world feel quiet and unforgiving. I wrapped my coat tighter, wishing my mom was there to guide me through this moment. She would have known what to say. She always did. I started down the walkway, trying to breathe, trying to make sense of what just happened. That was when I heard footsteps behind me. For a second, I thought it was my dad coming out to apologize, maybe even regret what he said. But when I turned, the porch light caught the face of a man in a long, dark coat, snow gathering on his shoulders. "Claire Halston?" he asked, his voice steady and calm despite the cold slicing through the air. I nodded, confused, still half frozen in place. "My name is Samuel Whitmore. I worked with your mom these past months. I've been trying to reach you. There is something important you need to know. Something she left specifically for you. There is one final section in her will, and she insisted it be delivered to you as soon as possible. I felt the ground under me shift, like someone had opened a door I did not know existed. Behind me was the house where I no longer belonged, where my dad and sister had just torn open a wound I had tried to heal for years. In front of me stood a man delivering a message straight from my mom, from the only person who ever truly saw me. Mom had left something for me, something she wanted me to have privately, something important enough that her lawyer had shown up in the snow on Christmas Eve. I stood there in the cold, my breath rising in the air, my heart pounding with hurt and something else I could not quite name yet. Maybe fear, maybe anger, maybe hope. Whatever it was, I knew one thing. Everything was about to change, but in that moment I felt nothing except numbness and cold, and a tiredness so deep it made my bones ache. Samuel stood there in the falling snow, his breath forming pale clouds in the air. The porch light above us cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the kind of lines people earn from years of delivering bad news. He said he had worked closely with my mom during her last months, and that she made him promise he would find me, no matter what happened. I heard him, but my mind was still stuck at the dinner table. My dad's voice slammed into me like a brick wall. The way he said the greatest gift I could give him was my disappearance. Lydia smirking with that cruel satisfaction only she could sharpen into. Something truly ugly. A part of me wanted to sink into the snow and let this stranger handle everything. Another part wanted to run and never look back. Daniel asked gently if I could come to his office the next morning. He said he had documents my mom prepared and a letter she insisted be given to me. He mentioned a voicemail he had already left, but added that he understood. Tonight was not a normal night. He did not pressure me. He simply held out a business card and told me he would be there after 10 in the morning and that my mom trusted me to handle what came next. I nodded. My throat felt tight, my voice useless, but I managed to thank him. He gave me a quiet, understanding look and walked back to his car. The headlights swept across the snow as he pulled away, leaving me standing on the walkway between the house I grew up in and the life my mom apparently believed I needed to step into. I walked to my old sedan, every step crunching through the thin, frozen layer covering the driveway. The windows had already begun to fog at the edges. When I got in and shut the door, the silence hit me like a physical thing. My forehead rested against the steering wheel, my breath fogging the cold leather. My hands shook uncontrollably, and my heart beat slow and heavy, like it was struggling under a thick weight. I could not go back to my apartment. Not tonight. The idea of sitting alone in my living room, replaying every awful moment, made my stomach twist. Without thinking, I turned the key in the ignition and pulled away from the curb, away from the warm, glowing windows of the house where my family had just pretended I no longer existed. The streets of Bloomington were almost empty. Houses were lined with Christmas lights and plastic reindeer. A few trees glowed softly in front windows. Behind each door was some version of family, some form of warmth, even if imperfect. I wondered how many people inside appreciated what they had. I wondered how many took it for granted until it was gone. My dad and Lydia had taken my mom for granted every single day of her life. The car turned almost automatically toward the one place that still belonged to her. Maple Ridge Church sat a few blocks off the main road, its brick walls damp with winter air, the white steeple rising into the dark sky. My mom had spent years in that sanctuary, leading choir rehearsals, folding blankets for charity drives, laughing with women from the community room. If any place held her echo, it was here. I pulled into the small lot and turned off the engine. For a moment, I sat quietly, letting the stillness wrap around me. Then the tears came, fast and hot, rolling down my cheeks without hesitation. I kept seeing my dad's face, the anger twisting it. I kept hearing Lydia's voice telling me she made sure I would get nothing. I kept remembering my mom's small gestures over the years, each one a gentle attempt to protect me from the people she herself had chosen to build a life with. I could have sat there forever, but after a while the cold crept under my jacket and nudged me forward. Mom would not have wanted me to fold into myself like that. She believed in facing the world, even when it hurt. I wiped my face with my sleeve and grabbed a tissue from the console, When I opened the door, the wind was sharp against my skin, but it grounded me. The steps leading up to the sanctuary were dusted with snow. I climbed them slowly and pushed the heavy wooden door open. Inside, the church was dim and quiet. A faint scent of candle wax and pine lingered in the air. Near the altar, a wreath glowed softly beside a small cluster of memorial candles. The sanctuary was nearly empty. The hush so complete, it felt like stepping into another world. I stood there taking in the stillness when a voice behind me said my name, Claire. "Is that you?" I turned and saw Pastor Elaine Brooks walking toward me with a stack of folders in her arms. She was in her early 60s, with a soft, collected presence that had comforted half the town at one point or another. Her expression shifted instantly when she saw my eyes, swollen and red. She told me she was glad to see me, but sorry it had to be tonight. She asked in a quiet voice if I had come from my dad's house. I nodded. She did not press. Instead, she set the folders on a pew and motioned for us to sit. The wood felt cold under my hands as we sat side by side. She asked how I had been since the funeral. I told her I was surviving, that the quiet moments were the worst, that I kept wanting to call my mom for things that did not matter, only to remember she was gone. She nodded and said grief often lived in the small moments. She asked gently about my dad and Lydia. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Embarrassment washed over me. It felt humiliating to admit how cruel they had been. So I said only that things were tense, without Mom to keep us stitched together. Pastor Elaine's eyes softened. She rested a hand lightly on my arm and said my mom spoke about me often, especially in the final months. She said my mom admired the way I cared for her, how I showed quiet strength, even when I doubted myself. Seeing that almost undid me again. Before I could speak, the sanctuary door opened, letting in a breath of cold air. Nora Bennett walked in carrying a tin, probably cookies, because Nora never went anywhere empty-handed in December. She stopped when she saw me. Her face shifted into a look that said she knew far more than I had ever told her. She approached and said she had been worried about me all day. Then she said something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. She said my mom had always been afraid this exact thing would happen, that once she was gone, whatever fragile piece existed in our family would collapse, and I would be left on the outside. I stared at her, stunned. I asked what my mom had told her, but Nora hesitated. She said some things were not hers to share, and that my mom had asked her, mostly to keep an eye on me if things went wrong. It was frustrating to hear that, to know my life had been discussed in quiet kitchens by people trying to protect me from the truth. Yet the fact that my mom had seen it all, clearly, before she died, sent a strange wave of comfort through my chest. After a few more kind words, Nora slipped away to leave a note in the prayer box. Pastor Elaine stood to prepare for a late service, but reminded me her door was always open. Left alone in the sanctuary, I let out a long breath. The candles flickered quietly at the front of the room, reflecting off the cross. The stillness felt less like emptiness and more like a pause before something shifted. Eventually, I walked back outside into the cold. Snow had started falling again. I got into my car and turned on the heater. When I looked down at my phone, I saw a missed call notification, a voicemail from earlier that evening. Samuel Whitmore. I pressed play. He said he had important documents from my mom, that she had been very specific about what needed to be given to me, that it was crucial I saw them soon. His last words made my breath catch. Your mom wanted to make sure you had a chance to protect yourself before it was too late. Too late. I stared through the windshield at the empty road ahead. Snowflakes drifted in slow spirals under the streetlights. Whatever my mom had prepared, it was not just a goodbye. It was a warning and a beginning. I sat there in the church parking lot a little longer, watching my breath fog the glass while Samuel's words circled in my mind. Important. Protect yourself. Too late. For years, I had survived by pretending things were fine, by minimizing, by calling cruelty complicated. But whatever version of my life that had worked before Christmas dinner was gone. Eventually, I drove home through quiet streets, past glowing porches and half-melted snowmen. In my apartment, I did not turn on the television. I made weak tea, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at the business card from Whitmore and Tate. It looked like something meant for someone stronger than me, someone who made decisions without shaking. Still, I set my alarm for mid-morning. When the alarm went off, the room was filled with pale winter light. For a split second, I forgot everything. Then the memory of my dad pointing at me at the dinner table snapped back, along with Lydia's smug little grin, and the image of Samuel standing calmly in the falling snow. I stood under the shower until the water cooled, trying to wash away the feeling of being unwanted in my own family. Then I dressed in the nicest sweater I owned, one that did not hold memories of Mom, pulled my hair back, and left the apartment before I could talk myself out of anything. Bloomington looked different that morning. Less festive, more exposed. Cars pulled in and out of big box stores, people rushing to return gifts. I passed then the clinic where I used to work part-time before Mom got sick. My old life felt close enough to touch, but far enough that I knew I could never go back to it unchanged. Whitmore and Tate sat in an old brick building near the courthouse. I parked and sat there for a moment with my hand on the door handle, reminding myself my mom had chosen this path for me. She had walked into this man's office because she trusted him. She trusted he would take care of what she could not fix herself. Inside, the reception area smelled like coffee and the faint scent of paper. A young receptionist greeted me by name as if I had expected. That alone made my pulse quicken. She gestured to a row of chairs, and I sat down, staring at the framed photos on the wall of Samuel at various charity events. After a few minutes, he appeared in the doorway, the same gentle steadiness as the night before, only without the snow on his shoulders. He greeted me softly and motioned for me to follow. His office was warm and cluttered. Books, case files, a drooping plant, a framed photo of what looked like his family. He invited me to sit, and for a moment we both stayed quiet, the kind of silence that lets you gather your courage. He started by telling me my mom had met with him several times in the last year. At first for routine planning, then later with concerns. He slid a folder across the desk but didn't open it yet. He said she had noticed unusual activity on her accounts, charges she did not recognize, withdrawals made when she was in the hospital. Small things at first, then larger. I already knew the answer before I asked whose names were attached to the extra cards. My voice still came out small when I asked. He confirmed gently that one was my dad's. Another had briefly been tied to an account Lydia accessed, supposedly to pay bills. But the spending did not match anything my mom would have approved. My grip on the arms of the chair tightened. I told him Mom had mentioned once that money was disappearing faster than she expected. She had dismissed it, saying she might be confused from medication. Samuel opened the folder then. Not a stack of overwhelming statements, just a few pages with highlighted lines. Purchases at a restaurant in another town on a day she had been bedridden. A large charge at a home goods store while she had been in chemo. A cash withdrawal that matched a debt my dad had mentioned in passing. He did not ask me to analyze any of it. He just wanted me to see enough to understand my mom had not imagined it. Someone had been draining her life quietly, one transaction at a time. While she was fighting to stay alive, I tasted bitterness at the back of my throat. All those nights I slept in a hospital chair. All those mornings I helped her dress when she could barely lift her arms. All those afternoons I held her hand while she cried. And while I did that, someone else used her name like a credit line on its last legs. I asked what my mom did next. His expression softened. He said she wasn't looking for a confrontation. She was looking for protection. She asked him to help her restructure some things so that, if the worst happened, I would not be left vulnerable. He explained simply that a portion of her savings had been set aside in a way that bypassed the usual process, like a locked box with my name on it that would open automatically at her passing. No approvals needed, no signatures from anyone else. It was hers to give, and she made sure she gave it to me alone. My eyes stung hearing that. I had always believed my mom saw more than she let on. Now I know for certain. He paused, then reached into a drawer and brought out a white envelope. My name is written on the front in my mom's handwriting. Seeing it tore through me. I could almost feel her hand pressing the pen to the paper. He slid it across the desk. She wrote this the day she signed the final version of her will. She asked that I give it to you only when I believed you were ready. He said he believed that time had come. I reached for the envelope with trembling fingers. It felt too heavy for its size. I could feel more than one sheet inside, maybe even a photograph or a document. Her handwriting on the outside was steady, stronger than she had been near the end. I swallowed hard and slipped it into my bag. I could not open it here, not with the smell of law books and copy toner in the air. He nodded, understanding. Then he mentioned the date and time for the will reading. He said my dad and Lydia would be required to attend. My stomach tightened. Of course they would. They probably believed they were walking into the easiest day of their lives. They had no idea my mom had seen them, truly seen them, in her final months. I thanked him and stood. He walked me to the reception area. The young woman gave me a sympathetic smile as we passed. I wondered how many daughters had walked this hallway in the weeks after, losing a mother. The hallway to the elevator was quiet. I pressed the call button and watched my faint reflection in the dull metal. My eyes were tired, my face too pale. But there was something new there, too. Resolve, maybe. The elevator arrived with a soft ding. The doors slid open. My breath caught. My dad and Lydia stood inside, shoulder to shoulder. Both were staring at me with expressions I knew too well. My dad looked irritated, like he had been waiting longer than he liked. Lydia's gaze flicked immediately to the bag at my shoulder, the one holding my mom's letter. It took every instinct I had not to flinch. I shifted subtly, turning the side of the bag away from them. For a moment, none of us moved. The air hummed with something sharp and cold. Lydia's eyes narrowed in that way that meant she sensed something had shifted, something she had not been warned about. My dad's jaw flexed, the muscle ticking. They were not here to mourn. They were here to claim. And for the first time in my life, I realized I was ready to stop letting them take. I kept my bag tight against my side as my dad and Lydia stepped fully out of the elevator. My dad's eyes flicked over me with that familiar irritation, the kind that always made me feel like some burden he had been forced to carry. Lydia gave me a thin smile that never reached her eyes, then brushed past me as if I were the one blocking her path. Neither of them said anything. They both just stared with open suspicion, like they already believed I was hiding something. Maybe they sensed it. Maybe they saw the shift in my posture, the way I guarded the envelope. Or maybe guilt sharpens the senses, and they were afraid I finally knew something they had spent years trying to hide. I stepped aside and let them pass. Lydia's perfume lingered in the hallway, sharp and floral, the same scent she had worn on the night of my mom's funeral when she whispered to a neighbor that some people grieve too dramatically. My stomach twisted at the memory. My dad did not look back once as they walked toward Samuel's office. I felt the elevator doors closing behind me, the soft hum surrounding me like a cocoon. I did not breathe until they slid shut and I was moving down to the lobby. By the time I reached the parking lot, my chest felt tight and my mind was spinning. I needed air. I needed space. I needed somewhere my dad and Lydia would never think to look. I drove back to my apartment with both hands gripping the wheel, my pulse jumping every time a car pulled up beside me at a stoplight. When I finally parked outside my building, I practically jogged up the stairs, unlocked the door with shaking fingers, and shut it firmly behind me. For the first time since the church parking lot, I let myself exhale. The envelope was still tucked in my bag, warm from being pressed against my body. I carried it into the tiny living room and sat on the sofa that dipped, slightly in the middle. My hands hovered over the flap, hesitating. I was afraid, not of what would happen next, but of the emotion waiting for me inside those pages. Her handwriting alone would undo me. After a long breath, I slid my thumb under the seal and opened it carefully. The first thing I saw was a folded letter on thick cream paper. Underneath it was a small brass key on a simple ring with a tag that read, Cabin 24. The tag was worn, the edges rounded from being handled many times. I set the key on the coffee table and unfolded the letter. My sweet Claire. Seeing those words in her handwriting was like being pulled backward through time. I could hear her voice, soft and steady, the same voice that used to wake me for school or whisper that everything would be all right when I cried into her shirt. She wrote that she hoped I would read the letter somewhere quiet, somewhere I felt safe. She said she knew I had carried more hurt in our family than anyone ever acknowledged. She wished she could take it all from me, but she could not. What she could do, she said, was protect me in the ways she still had control over. She wrote that she had seen the way my dad and Lydia looked at her accounts, her belongings, her life, long before she got sick. She wrote that she had once believed they were simply careless or thoughtless, but as time went on, she realized they had been making plans that did not include her or me. She explained that she had accidentally opened the wrong email thread one afternoon when she was searching for a recipe her friend had sent. In that thread, she found a series of messages between my dad and Lydia, discussing what my dad called future arrangements. They talked about how to manage things once Margaret was gone. They discussed which assets should be handled first and how to simplify matters to avoid outside interference, and she wrote that the phrasing chilled her because she could see clearly that the interference they wanted to avoid was me. She wrote that at first she tried to ignore it, hoping she misunderstood, but then she began noticing charges on her credit card that she did not recognize. She went to the bank and found out about the secondary card my dad had been using. When she pressed him gently about it, he brushed her off, saying he had forgotten to mention a few expenses. But she said something in his eyes that day unsettled her in a way she could not shake. She wrote that she then asked to review her statements more closely, and when she saw Lydia's name appear in connection with one of the accounts, she understood the truth. She realized she needed to separate at least part of what she had saved over, the years before it was absorbed by them the moment she closed her eyes for the last time. She wrote that she had gone to Samuel with a request that broke her heart. She did not want to divide her family, she said, but she could not bear the thought of leaving me unprotected, especially after watching how often my dad and Lydia dismissed me, mocked my choices, and treated me as if I were somehow less deserving of dignity. Then she wrote something that made my breath catch. Claire, I know my passing will not bring our house together. I have felt for years that when I am no longer the bridge, they will look for the easiest person to push aside. That person has always been you, my darling girl. My vision blurred as I read that line. She knew. She saw it coming long before I did. She wrote that the cabin in Traverse City had been hers since before I was born, gifted to her by her aunt, who believed every woman needed a place that was fully her own. She said she had never put my dad's name on it for reasons she did not fully understand at the time, but she was grateful now. She wrote that she wanted me to have it, to know there was at least one place on earth where I could close a door and no one could tell me to leave. She wrote that she had kept the cabin a secret these last few years because she feared they would try to fold it into their plans the same way they had done with everything else. She wrote that she hoped one day I would go there, breathe the pine-scented air, sit on the porch swing, and feel surrounded by something that belonged to me in every way. She ended with a few lines that I reread again and again. Claire, please do not let them convince you that you are small. You have always been the strongest person I know. I wanted to give you something that would remind you of who you are. If you ever feel alone, go to the cabin. It is your place now. And remember that I loved you every single day of my life. I pressed the letter against my chest and curled forward, elbows on my knees, tears falling onto the paper. It was not the kind of crying that makes noise. It was the quiet kind that drains you from the inside out. I wiped my cheek with the back of my sleeve, careful not to smear the ink. After a while, I picked up the key again and turned it over in my fingers. Cabin 24, Traverse City. A place my dad never knew about. A place Lydia could not touch. A place my mom had kept safe for me. There was a small folded paper tucked behind the letter. I had not noticed it at first. When I opened it, I found a simple hand-drawn map and the combination to a storage locker in Traverse City, written in the same looping handwriting. At the bottom, she wrote that inside the locker were items she had gathered in case I ever needed a fresh start. Clothes, blankets, family keepsakes that she feared would disappear if left in the house. As I read the final line, the ache in my chest deepened. I always hoped I was wrong, Claire. But if I was right, please promise me you will choose yourself. I sat back on the sofa, feeling the walls of my apartment shift slightly around me, as if the entire space had tilted. Everything I thought I knew about my family, everything I had convinced myself was just tension or misunderstanding, had a different shape now. My mom had not been confused. She had not been paranoid. She had been preparing. And somewhere deep inside, she had been afraid for me in ways she had never said out loud. I folded the letter again, hands still trembling, and placed it gently back into the envelope. The key lay beside it, cool and solid, as if waiting for me to decide what came next. I stared at them, feeling the weight of her words settle into my bones. The cabin was real. The fears were real. And the people who wanted me out of the picture were probably already thinking about their next move. In that small, quiet living room, with winter light fading outside the windows, I realized that my mom had left me more than a warning. She had left me a starting point, a place to run to, a place to rebuild, and a reason to finally stop letting them decide the shape of my life. I lifted the key again, feeling its cold edges press into my palm, when a sudden knock sounded at my front door. The knock jolted me so hard I almost dropped the key. For a second, I just sat there, frozen, listening. It came again, a little louder, knuckles on cheap wood, echoing through my small apartment. My mind did the quickest, ugly math. It was too early for a delivery. None of my friends ever just showed up, which left two possibilities I did not want to deal with. My dad? Or Lydia. I set the key back on the table as quietly as I could and held my breath. Whoever it was did not call my name. They just knocked one more time, waited. Then, after a long moment, I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. A door closed somewhere below, and the building went still again. My heart kept racing even after the sounds faded. I leaned back into the sofa, staring at the ceiling, feeling that familiar mix of fear and anger rising in my chest. It felt like the worst months of my life were layering themselves on top of the night I had just lived through, stacking up until I could barely tell where one ended and the next began. All at once, I was back there, in that beige hospital room with its humming machines and plastic chairs, learning to live on bad coffee and broken sleep while my mom slowly disappeared in front of me. I had quit my job at the clinic in July when it became clear that this was not going to be a few bad weeks. They wanted me to cut down my hours, not leave completely, but I could see in their eyes that they were already counting the days until they replaced me. I chose her. It was not even a question. Most mornings started the same. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and old air. The fluorescent lights buzzed. I would stop by the nurse's station to check in before I walked into her room. There was one nurse, Janie, who always gave me a small, tired smile. "Your mom had a rough night, honey," she would say softly. Pain was up. "We got it under control, but she is worn out." And then she would add, almost every time, "She keeps asking if you have eaten." Even when she was exhausted and nauseous, Mom worried about whether I had breakfast. That was so like her, it hurt. One afternoon, a few weeks into her hospital stay, the oncologist pulled me aside into the hallway while Mom dozed. He was a tall man with kind eyes behind his glasses, but there was a tension in his shoulders that day that I had not seen before. He spoke carefully. He said that there had been some discussion about adjusting Mom's treatment plan. Fewer scans, less aggressive medication, more focus on comfort. He stressed that no decisions had been made yet, that he wanted my input as well as hers. I frowned and asked what had started this discussion. He hesitated just a second too long. Then he said that my dad had asked about options to reduce costs, mentioning that it might not make sense to keep spending so much on treatment. That might not change the outcome. The words hit me like a slap. Reduce costs. My mom was not a broken appliance. She was a person, and she still had a fight left in her. I asked him if Mom had said she wanted to cut back. He said no, that when he talked to her, she had actually seemed more hopeful since the last round, though tired. He said he was obligated to consider all perspectives, but that ultimately he wanted to focus on her wishes, not just the financial side. The hallway suddenly felt too narrow. I pictured my dad sitting at the kitchen table, bills spread out, talking about numbers while my mom lay in the next room trying to breathe through the pain. I could not tell if I was angrier at him for asking to save money or at myself for not being there when he did it. I asked the doctor very clearly to continue with the treatment plan unless my mom asked otherwise. I said that she deserved every chance she could reasonably have. He nodded and agreed, and the conversation ended there. But the seed of something dark had been planted in me. Later that evening, when Janie came in to adjust the drip, she found me sitting on the little couch by the window, staring at the monitor. She fussed gently with the tubes, then paused and looked over at me. "You are doing right by her, you know," she said quietly. "Not everyone stays." "Not like this." I shrugged, my throat tight, and said something about just doing what any daughter would do. She shook her head and told me that was not always true. She leaned closer, her voice even softer, and said that most of the time my mom talked to her, she did not complain about her pain. She was worried about me, whether I was getting enough rest, whether I could pay my rent, whether my dad and Lydia were being fair. That last part stayed with me long after Janie left the room. My dad's visits were infrequent and always short. He would come in smelling faintly of motor oil and cigarettes, sit for 10 or 15 minutes, make a comment about the game on television, and then leave, muttering something about things to do at the shop. Lydia came even less often. When she did, it was like she was there on business, not out of affection. I remember one particular afternoon so clearly, it feels burned into my brain. Mom was having a better day. Her color was a little less gray, and she had managed to eat a few bites of pudding. I was helping her smooth her hair when Lydia breezed in, her expensive boots clicking on the tile, her phone in her hand. She kissed the air somewhere near Mom's cheek and said how sorry she was she had not been able to come by more. Work was crazy. The market was nuts. She laughed lightly about stressed buyers and picky sellers, and I felt a flicker of bitterness at how far removed her world seemed from the bed in front of us. Before Mom could say much, Lydia's tone shifted. She pulled a folder from her bag and said she needed to ask a few questions about Mom's health insurance and what accounts were connected to what. It would only take a minute, she promised. Mom looked tired and confused, but she tried to answer. She mentioned the primary policy through Dad's old job, another small policy from the school where she had worked, some savings accounts she had set aside over the years. Lydia flipped through the papers with an efficiency that made my skin crawl. I finally stepped in and asked why we were talking about all this today. Mom needed rest, not a meeting with her self-appointed financial manager. Lydia gave me that look, the one that made me feel 13 again. She said in her sweetest voice that someone had to think ahead, and that I clearly did not have the head for numbers. She said it was better to have things organized before the crisis hit. I pointed around the room and said that this was the crisis. Mom shifted uncomfortably, caught between us. She reached for my hand first, then for Lydia's, and asked us please not to fight in front of her. She said she trusted us both, and that she was sure we could figure it out, together. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. After a few more questions about beneficiary names and account types, Lydia seemed satisfied. She hugged Mom lightly, told her she would pray for her, and then turned to me at the door. She murmured that if I really wanted to help, I should let the people who understood paperwork handle the hard parts and focus on fluffing pillows. I waited until she left the room before I let my face show what I felt. Mom squeezed my hand and whispered that she was sorry for the tension. She said she knew it was hard having so many opinions flying around. I wanted to tell her that it was not everyone. It was them. It was always them. As the weeks went by, little things started adding up. My dad asks more often about costs, mentioning that Mom would not want to leave us in debt. Lydia making casual comments about how medical bills could swallow an estate if you were not careful. A stray sentence overheard about not pouring good money after bad. One evening, while Mom was sleeping and the television played some old sitcom quietly in the background, I stepped out into the hallway to stretch my legs. Near the vending machine, I saw my dad and Lydia talking in low voices. They did not see me. He was saying that he did not know how much longer they could keep this up, that the numbers were not looking good. Lydia told him there were ways to simplify things, that if they played it right, most of what was left could still end up in the right hands. She said something about making sure the house stayed in the family. Her emphasis on the word family made my stomach churn. Then she added that I was too emotional to be involved in these decisions. I stood there, hidden around the corner, listening to them discuss my mom's life like an account they were trying to balance before the end of the quarter. Something inside me hardened that night. A seed of anger took root, slow and deep. Back in Mom's room, I sat in the dark by her bed and watched her sleep. watched her chest rise and fall, and listened to the faint rattle in every breath. I thought about all the years she had saved, scrimping from a teacher's paycheck, clipping coupons, putting a little aside each month for the future. And now the people she trusted most were talking about that future like it was, already theirs to divide. She stirred and opened her eyes, sensing something in the room. I forced a small smile and smoothed her blanket. She looked at me for a long moment, tired knowing in her gaze, then whispered that she was glad I was there, that she slept better when I was in the chair across from her. I told her I was not going anywhere. Even as I said it, a quiet fear was beginning to grow in me. Not about losing her, though that fear was always there, like a dull ache. This was something sharper, a realization that when she was gone, the flimsy balance she held in our family would collapse, and I would be standing where the pieces landed. Sitting now in my apartment, months later, the letter in my lap and the memory of those days flooding me, I could see it clearly. She had seen it too. That was why she had gone to Samuel. That was why she had set money aside and kept a cabin hidden in another state. That was why, when I thought back to those hallway conversations and those careful questions from Lydia about insurance and accounts, my anger no longer felt like an overreaction. It felt like the beginning of understanding what I was really up against. That feeling stayed with me through the next 2 days, curling itself under every breath I took. I tried to distract myself with laundry and dishes, but nothing dulled it. Every time I passed the coffee table and saw my mom's letter or the brass cabin key, the same weight settled back into my chest. My dad and Lydia were not just selfish. They were preparing for a life where I did not exist at all. By the morning of December 27th, I felt both numb and wired. The sky had that heavy winter gray, the color of tin. I dressed in quiet clothes, dark pants, a sweater, and my long coat. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone older than 32, someone who had lived a very long year. The drive to Samuel's office felt heavier than before. The streets were still half decorated for Christmas, but the magic was gone. I found a parking spot, sat with the engine off, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles hurt. I reminded myself that my mom had planned for this meeting. She wanted me here. I owed her at least that much. Inside the lobby, the front desk receptionist gave me a polite smile. She told me Mr. Whitmore would be with us shortly. She said us because my dad and Lydia were already there. They sat side by side in the waiting chairs. Dad's cuff buttons were undone. Lydia's makeup was flawless, but her expression was hard. As soon as I stepped into the room, their eyes cut toward me. My dad gave a small snort and looked away. Lydia leaned toward me with a smile that had no warmth. "So you came to watch other people get what is coming to them." She whispered it, but she wanted me to hear it. She wanted the receptionist to hear it too. I met her eyes. I told her quietly that I came because my mom wanted me to. Nothing more. David muttered that Mom would be heartbroken knowing I was trying to stir up trouble over paperwork. Paperwork. That was how he described the last wishes of the woman he'd been married to. For more than 3 decades, the door to the back hallway opened, and Samuel appeared with a folder under his arm. He greeted each of us and invited us into his office. We filed in silently, like 3 strangers forced to share a narrow doorway. Dad took the middle chair, Lydia the right. I sat on the left, my bag in my lap, my fingertips brushing the envelope inside. Daniel sat behind his desk, removed his glasses, cleaned them, then began. He explained that he had worked closely with my mom on her will, and that today he would read the primary provisions and answer questions. He began with standard items: debts, personal belongings, a few donations to local charities. My dad started relaxing almost immediately. The main household assets, including the Bloomington house, would go to my dad. That was expected. The joint accounts would fully transition to him. Also expected. There was a small personal gift to Lydia, framed as a thank you for support when Mom first became ill. Lydia smoothed her skirt and smiled politely, but her eyes flicked to me with unmistakable satisfaction. In their minds, the meeting was already over. The balance of the world, the one where I was an afterthought and they were the center, had been restored. Then Samuel cleared his throat and reached for a separate document. He explained that in September of the previous year, my mom had signed a formal amendment to her original will. He said the amendment had been verified for clarity and intent. His tone shifted slightly when he said clarity, and I watched Lydia's shoulders stiffen. He began to read. He stated that any and all interest my mom held in a property located in Traverse City, Michigan, specifically a cabin she had owned outright before her marriage, would be transferred fully and exclusively to her daughter, Claire Halston. For a moment, no one breathed. My dad's head jerked toward Samuel, then toward me, then back again. A deeper line carved itself between his brows. Lydia blinked once, twice, then sat completely still. Samuel continued as if reading the weather report. He explained that my mom had also designated a separate financial account, one she had maintained privately, to go directly to me. He emphasized that this account had been structured to bypass probate entirely and was not subject to division. Dad finally found his voice. He said this made no sense, that everything they had belonged to both of them, and that if there was a property in Michigan, he deserved at least part of it. He said it sharply, like ownership was something he could claim by volume. Samuel shook his head gently. He said the cabin was purchased and titled in my mom's name alone before marriage, and that under state law, it qualified as separate property. She had every legal right to give it to whomever she chose. Lydia stood up so suddenly that her chair scraped across the floor. She demanded to know what account Samuel was referring to. She insisted that all accounts had already been listed. Daniel replied calmly that this account had been kept private by my mom, intentionally. He reminded her that it was her right to do so. Lydia's cheeks blotched with color. She turned to my dad and hissed that they should have been informed. David said through clenched teeth that there must be a mistake, that my mom would never leave me something so significant without telling him. But the truth was written across both of their faces. They believed she could. They just never imagined she would. Samuel read the rest of the amendment slowly. Clearly, he said that the property and funds were to be transferred with all rights and privileges. He said my mom's intent was written plainly, to provide security for her daughter, and that the inheritance should not be altered by any challenge from family members. My dad leaned forward, his voice rising. He accused Samuel of manipulating Mom when she was vulnerable. He asked what kind of lawyer ripped a family apart. He said all the things people say when they realize they are losing control. Samuel remained composed. He said my mom had been fully aware, fully lucid, and deeply thoughtful when she signed the amendment. Lydia finally dropped the last piece of her politeness. She lashed out, saying I must have pressured Mom, that I had always been jealous, that I wanted more than my share. Her voice shook as she spoke, more from anger than grief. And for a moment, I saw something raw in her. Not sadness, fear. My dad pounded a fist on the arm of his chair. He said he would contest the amendment, that he would not be pushed aside by some last-minute decision made behind his back. His voice cracked near the end, the first crack in his certainty. Samuel let the outburst finish. Then he placed the amendment gently on the desk and folded his hands. He said my mom understood this reaction might come. That was why she had written specific language in her instructions. He read it quietly, without theatrics. To protect my daughter from retaliation or pressure, these assets are given freely, irrevocably, and with full intent. They are not to be challenged or diluted by any party. This is my decision alone, made without coercion. The room felt strangely small at that moment. My dad looked like someone had drained the air from his lungs. Lydia's hands trembled where they gripped the back of her chair. Me? I felt something shift inside. Not triumph, not even relief, just a strange, profound steadiness, as if my mom had reached out across time, set her hand on my shoulder, and told me that for once, I could stop bracing myself. Outside the window, snow fell softly, the quiet kind that muffles every sound. Inside, the silence stretched long enough that I could hear my own breathing. When my dad finally spoke again, his voice was lower, tighter. He asked what exactly was in the account. He wanted numbers, exact amounts, proof that he was losing something. Samuel declined to give specifics in front of the group, saying that details would be provided privately to me as designated beneficiary. For the first time, Lydia's expression cracked. Panic flickered through her eyes, and that was when I understood why they were so furious. They had not lost property. They had lost control. David leaned back in his chair, staring at the floor. Lydia's breath came fast, shallow. They no longer looked like victors. They looked like gamblers who had just realized someone else held the winning hand. Samuel closed the folder and said this completed the reading. He asked if there were any final questions before he prepared the transfer. Documents. No one answered. I felt myself rise slowly from my chair, my legs steady in a way they had not been in months. I picked up my bag, feeling the weight of the envelope and the key inside. We walked out together in brittle silence. Dad led the way. Lydia followed. I came last, letting a few steps fall between us. When we reached the hallway, my dad stopped abruptly and turned toward me. His face was pale, his jaw set. "This is not over," he said. The words did not shake me the way he wanted them to, because for the first time in a long time, it felt like something was just beginning. My dad's eyes were hard when he said that this was not over, but underneath the anger, I saw something new, something that looked a lot like fear. Lydia stood just behind him in the hallway, her arms folded tight across her chest, her jaw clenched. For a heartbeat, the three of us stood there in that narrow space, like pieces on a board no one quite knew how to move anymore. Then Samuel's voice came from behind us, calm and steady. He said that there was one more section he needed to review, something my mom had asked to be addressed last. He called it the final section of her instructions. My dad turned back toward the office, clearly annoyed, but the words "final section" caught his attention enough that he did not walk out. He muttered that this had gone on long enough. Lydia gave me one sharp look, then followed him back inside. I went in last, feeling that shift again, like the room itself was bracing for what was coming. We sat down in the same chairs. The folder was still open on the desk, but now Samuel reached into the bottom of his briefcase and pulled out a thinner, sealed envelope. He handled it differently than the others, a little more carefully, before he opened it and unfolded several stapled pages. He said that in addition to the will and the amendment for the cabin and separate funds, my mom had prepared a supplemental statement. She had done so with the help of a financial advisor, a man named Evan Turner, and had asked that it be attached to her file and read only if there was significant dispute or confusion about her intent. My dad scoffed under his breath at the words dispute and confusion. Lydia sat very still, eyes narrowed, shoulders tense. Samuel glanced at them, then at me, then began to read in that same measured voice. He explained that my mom had documented concerns about the way some of her context accounts had been used in the last year of her life. With the help of Evan, she had gathered copies of specific receipts and statements. Samuel did not slide them across the desk yet. He simply summarized them enough to make it clear what they were. There were store receipts that matched charges from her card on days my mom had been in the hospital, in towns she had not left her bed to visit. There were records showing payments to a local hardware and supply store, amount that aligned almost exactly with the debt my dad had once complained about, saying he had finally cleared it off his back. There were also summaries of purchases from a high-end clothing boutique and a spa a few counties away, matching dates when Lydia had posted pictures online from a weekend away. My dad shifted in his chair, his cheeks turning a mottled red. He cut in, saying that those charges were normal family spending, nothing sinister. He insisted that as her husband, he had every right to use the accounts. His voice got louder as he went, more brittle at the edges. Samuel did not argue with him. He simply clarified that my mom had not been aware of all of these transactions when they occurred, and that when she found them later, she felt betrayed and frightened. She worried not only about the money, but about what it said regarding the way she was being treated while she was vulnerable. Then Samuel set the stack of pages down and picked up one particular sheet. His face folded briefly into something sad, then smoothed again. He told us that attached to the final section were 2 printed emails. Both had been retrieved with my mom's permission when she suspected that her accounts were being discussed behind her back. The first, he explained, was from Lydia to my dad. In that message, Lydia outlined her thoughts on what she called long-term planning. She suggested that once my mom passed, it would be simpler if the house went directly to my dad, and from him, eventually, to her. She wrote that this would keep things in the right hands and avoid, as she put it, complications caused by other people. He did not have to say who other people meant. The words hung there, heavy and obvious. The second email, Samuel said, was a reply from my dad. In it, He agreed that they needed to make sure the house and most of the assets stayed with what he called the real family. There was a line about not letting sentiment cloud business, a line about not dragging things out, and a reference to medical costs being a useful reason to consolidate accounts. As he read that, I felt something inside me go cold. It was one thing to suspect. It was another to hear, in plain language, that while I had been sitting at my mom's bedside, they had been writing to each other about how to move her life into their names with as little interference as possible. Lydia's face had gone pale. She shot a quick look at my dad, then back at the papers. She said that this was being taken out of context, that everyone sends emails when they are stressed. She said that thinking ahead was not a crime. My dad tried a different angle. He said that my mom had no right to go through his messages. He said that any information Evan had obtained was a violation of privacy. He questioned whether any of it would stand up if challenged. Samuel responded that my mom had accessed only messages related to her own accounts and that all information was obtained legally with her cooperation and with the assistance of the bank. He added, carefully, that she had signed statements verifying the authenticity of the emails and authorizing their use if necessary to explain her decisions later. The room felt tighter with every word. Then Samuel lifted another sheet, this one with my mom's handwriting scanned at the top. He said that this was the core of the final section. It was a signed statement she had written, explaining in her own words why she had made certain choices. He read parts of it aloud. She described feeling increasingly uneasy about discussions she overheard about her house and savings. She wrote that she was especially disturbed by comments suggesting that my presence would complicate matters, and by hints that her care might be adjusted for financial reasons. She did not name my dad or Lydia directly in that paragraph, but she did not have to. She wrote that she had decided to secure the cabin and the separate funds as a way of making sure her youngest child would not be left entirely dependent on the goodwill of people who had already shown reluctance to respect her needs. She wrote that her hope was that this would never be needed, that her family would come together in kindness. But she also wrote that her experience told her she needed to prepare for the opposite. At one point, she wrote in simple, clear language that she understood some people might see her decisions as favoritism, but that in truth, they were protection. She emphasized that she wanted me to have at least one place and one source of support that could not be taken from me out of anger or resentment. By the time Samuel finished that page, there was a ringing in my ears. Hearing her words, formal and final, describing things I had only sensed in the dark, felt like having someone pull back a curtain I had been afraid to touch. My dad exploded then. He said that this was all a setup, that someone must have encouraged Mom to think the worst of him. He accused Samuel of guiding her into paranoia, of planting ideas. His voice rose until it was almost a shout. He demanded to know who this Evan person thought he was, interfering in his family. His words tumbled over each other, the way they used to when he was cornered in an argument at home and realized he had said too much. Lydia jumped in, turning her anger on me. She said that I had always played the victim, that I probably spent my nights whispering poison in Mom's ear, making her think everyone was out to get her. She said that the only reason Mom would go this far was if someone had pressured her. Samuel raised a hand slightly, not to silence them, but to ask for a pause. He reminded them that my mom had requested those documents be attached for clarity, not to argue with them from beyond the grave. He said that he could not speak to every emotional dynamic in our family, but he could confirm that she had been calm, thoughtful, and insistent that her wishes be honored. Then he looked directly at me. There was no softness in his voice now, no cushioning of the words, just quiet truth. He said that in his professional opinion and in his personal observation, my mom had made these choices for one main reason. She believed that I was the one who had been there for her when it mattered, and the one who was most likely to be hurt when she was gone. She did this, he said, to protect you. Hearing that, something inside me finally broke loose, not in a messy way, but in a clear way. All the years of swallowing my hurt, of telling myself I was too sensitive, that I was reading things wrong, that maybe I really was the problem, started to crumble. I looked at my dad and my sister, really looked at them, and saw how tightly they held on to their anger, how invested they were in a version of the story where they were always right, and I was always in the way. Then I thought of my mom lying in that hospital bed, writing out these statements, choosing her words carefully, trusting a stranger like Evan and a lawyer like Samuel more than she trusted the people sitting beside me now when it came to my future. The office was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. It was the quiet that comes after a truth has been spoken out loud, the kind you cannot unhear. My dad turned his face away, staring at a spot on the wall. Lydia's hands had dropped to her sides. Her shoulders shook just slightly. Whether from anger or something else, I could not tell. As for me, I sat there, my palms flat against my knees, feeling my mom's choices surround me like a shield I had never known I had. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. My mom had seen me. She had believed me, and she had left a record no one in that room could erase. The words were still hanging in the air when my dad lurched up from his chair. The legs screeched against the floor and made everyone jump. His face had gone a deep, blotchy red, the way it used to when he lost his temper over something small, like a late bill or a burned dinner. He leaned over the desk, jabbing a finger in my direction. His voice came out rough and loud. "You did this. You are the one who ruined everything. You are a destroyer." That word stung, not because it was true, but because he believed it so completely, as if the years I spent sitting beside my mom's hospital bed counted for nothing. As if the only thing that mattered was that he had just lost control over something he thought belonged to him. He kept going. He said I had turned my mom against her own family. He said I had whispered in her ear, made her think he was stealing from her, that I had twisted normal life into some kind of crime. Spit gathered at the corner of his mouth, his hands shaking on the edge of the desk. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lydia stand up too. Tears were already running down her cheeks, dark mascara smudging under her eyes. She looked wrecked, but when her gaze snapped to me, it was full of something sharp and cold. "You always wanted to be the victim," she cried, her voice pitching high. "You wanted everyone to feel sorry for you. Congratulations, you got what you wanted." She waved toward the papers on the desk. House in Michigan. Money. Poor little Claire finally gets something. Samuel rose from his chair slowly. He did not raise his voice, but there was iron in it when he spoke. He told my dad to sit back down. He said that no one was going to yell at anyone in his office, especially not in a way that felt threatening. He added quietly that if they could not control themselves, he would have to ask them to step outside. My dad did not sit. He turned his whole body toward me, fingers still out, shoulders tense. For a second, I thought he might come around the desk. The old fear kicked in, that instinct I had as a child to shrink back when he got like this. But something in me refused to move. For the first time I can remember, I straightened my back instead of curling inward. I met his eyes and held them. My hands were still shaking, but my voice, when it came, was clear. "Mom saw all of this long before I did," I said. "She saw how you both talked about her house like she was already gone. She saw how you used her accounts without asking. She saw the way you treated me when she was not in the room. I do not have to prove anything to you. She already knows who you are." My dad's face twisted, like the words physically hurt him. Lydia let out a choked sound, somewhere between a sob and a curse. Samuel stepped around the desk then, positioning himself slightly between us. He looked at my dad, not intimidated in the least. He said that this conversation had gone as far as it could for today. He told my dad and Lydia that for everyone's safety and sanity, they needed to leave his office now. He reminded them that there were formal channels for any further disputes, and those channels did not involve yelling at me. For a moment, I thought my dad might refuse. His jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. Then he exhaled hard, like he had been punched, and turned away. Lydia wiped her eyes roughly and grabbed her purse, her fingers fumbling at the strap. They walked to the door, and just before my dad stepped through, he looked back at me over his shoulder. His voice dropped lower, but the venom stayed. "You destroyed this family," he said. "Do not expect us to pick up any pieces for you when that money runs out." He slammed the door behind him. The sound echoed off the shelves. My knees felt weak, but I did not sit yet. I watched the closed door, listening to their footsteps recede down the hallway. The silence they left was heavy and strange. Samuel turned to me, his expression softer now. He asked if I was all right. I nodded, though I did not trust my voice just then. He suggested I sit a moment and breathe before I left, and said there was no rush. He went back around the desk to tuck the documents away. I dropped into the chair, my hands finally unclenching. The adrenaline that had kept me upright began to ebb, leaving a tremor in its place. I pressed my palms against my thighs to steady them. After a minute, Samuel told me that my mom would have been proud of how I handled myself. He said not everyone could sit through what I had just sat through without breaking. I managed a small, tired smile. I thanked him for everything, for believing her, for honoring her wishes, even when it would have been easier to gloss over the ugly parts. He shrugged it off, saying he was just doing his job, but I could see in his eyes that it was more than that for him. He had liked her. He respected her. That mattered. He walked me out into the hallway. At the door to the reception area, he paused and reminded me that once the paperwork was processed, he would call me with the next steps about the cabin and the account. He told me again that if there were any threats or harassment, I should let him know. There were ways to handle that. I nodded and stepped through the door. The waiting area was empty, but I could hear voices near the elevator. Angry voices, muffled but recognizable. My dad and Lydia. For a second, I thought about taking the stairs, avoiding them completely. Then I felt my mom's letter like a weight in my bag, and I walked forward instead. As I came around the corner, the elevator dinged and its doors slid open. Lydia was standing with her back to me, talking in a harsh whisper to my dad. When she heard my footsteps, she turned. Her eyes were still red, mascara streaked, but she had pulled herself together enough to put the mask back on. She stepped away from my dad and moved toward me, blocking my path to the elevator doors. Her hand shot out and grabbed my forearm. Her fingers dug into my coat sleeve. It was not a friendly touch. It was an anchor and a threat all at once. "Listen," she said, trying to keep her voice low, though it still trembled. "We can fix this. You know Mom did not think things through at the end. She was scared. She was on medication. She was not herself." I pulled my arm back a little, but she held on. "At least be reasonable," she continued. "That cabin, whatever is in those accounts, it is too much for you to handle alone. You have always needed guidance. You know that. Let us work something out. We can split it 3 ways, or even 2. Just do not freeze us out." Her words might have sounded generous to someone who did not know her, but I knew. The calculation was visible in her eyes, in the way her mouth twitched when she said, "Too much for you to handle alone." Behind her, my dad stood with his arms crossed, watching. He did not step in. He let her do the talking, the coaxing. That was their pattern. He applied pressure. She offered the illusion of rescue. For a long moment, I just looked at her hand on my arm. I thought about every time she had brushed off my feelings as drama. Every time she had told my mom I was too sensitive, too soft, too naive. Every whispered comment at family gatherings about how I could not survive on my own. And then I thought about my mom's voice in that letter. "Choose yourself." I gently but firmly pulled my arm free. Lydia's fingers slipped off my sleeve. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain or justify. I simply said that I was going to follow what Mom wrote, nothing more and nothing less. Her face crumpled in a new way then, a mix of outrage and fear. "You cannot do this," she hissed. "You cannot just shut us out. We are your family." Family, the same word she had used at Christmas, right before she laughed about me being homeless. I stepped past her toward the elevator. My dad muttered something under his breath that sounded a lot like ungrateful. There might have been another word in there too, one he used whenever he wanted to remind me that I was always, in his eyes, the problem. I pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to close, I glanced up and caught his eyes for just a second. For the first time, he looked smaller to me. Not physically, but the power he had always held over me, the kind that comes from being a parent whose approval you chase your whole life, had thinned. He shouted after me that this was not finished. Lydia called my name, a strangled, frustrated sound, but the doors slid shut between us before they could say more. In the quiet of the elevator, my own reflection stared back at me in the brushed metal. My hands were still shaking, but they were empty. No one was holding me in place anymore. By the time the doors opened onto the lobby, my breathing had slowed. I walked past the receptionist, out into the cold Bloomington air, and for the first time since my mom died, I felt something other than grief or fear rise up in me. I felt a thin, bright line of certainty. Whatever my dad and Lydia chose to do next, however loudly they raged or pleaded, my mom had already done the one thing that mattered most. She had made sure I did not have to stay their victim. That single thought stayed with me in the quiet days that followed. My dad and Lydia kept calling, sending texts that swung between guilt, rage, and desperation. But I ignored them. I needed space, and more than that, I needed to breathe. 2 mornings later, I packed a small duffel bag, locked my apartment, and started the drive toward Traverse City, Michigan. 6 hours on the road felt exactly right, like enough distance to leave behind the noise and find whatever peace my mom had tucked away for me. The highways were half covered in snow, the sky a pale winter gray. I watched Indiana flatten away in my rearview mirror, replaced by long stretches of Michigan pine and frozen fields that shimmered beneath the weak sun. With every mile, I felt something inside me loosen, as if the knots in my chest were finally allowing air through. When the GPS announced the turn toward a narrow lane lined with tall pines, my pulse jumped. I eased the car down the snow-packed road until I saw it. The cabin. Small, quiet, set back from the trees just enough to catch the light. The kind of place that would have made my mom exhale in relief the moment she arrived. I stepped out of the car and closed my eyes for a moment against the cold air. It smelled like pine and clean wood smoke. And even though no one had lit a fire for months, I imagined my mom standing where I was now, her eyes lifted to the same treetops. She must have loved this place. The front door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin glowed with a kind of warm simplicity. A worn couch, a little dining table, a stone fireplace. Nothing luxurious, but everything comforting. Everything is intentional. On the coffee table sat a wooden box, polished smooth. A note in my mom's handwriting was taped on top. All it said was, "For Claire." My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was a journal, its cover faded blue and edges soft from being handled many times. Underneath were a few letters, an old photo, and a key tag from a storage unit. I sat on the couch, pulled the blanket around my lap, and opened the journal. The first entries were soft memories. She described summers here when I was barely old enough to walk, how she brought me just once when Dad stayed behind, claiming he had work, how peaceful the woods were then, how she dreamed that someday I would return as an adult who finally understood what quiet could heal. As the pages turned, the tone shifted. She wrote about my dad's temper, about Lydia's eye-rolling and dismissive comments, about how she tried, year after year, to smooth everything over, but worried I was being worn down by the constant criticism. Then came the entries about her illness, the shock of the diagnosis, the weight of keeping the peace, even while exhausted, the fear that I would be left alone with 2 people who saw me as an inconvenience. She wrote that once she overheard my dad saying money would be easier to manage once she was gone. Another entry described Lydia asking pointed questions about insurance, early disguising her impatience. Still, she tried to give them the benefit of the doubt, until the day she checked her credit card statements. She described her confusion first, then her dread. Arges at stores she had never visited. Payment for hardware supplies on days she had been in the hospital. A spa weekend in northern Michigan that lined up exactly with one of Lydia's. Social media posts. And then one entry that made me grip the journal so tightly the spine cracked slightly. I'm not paranoid. Something is happening behind my back. And if something happens to me, Claire will be alone with them. She wrote about meeting with Samuel, and then with Evan, the financial advisor who helped her sort through her accounts. She didn't describe everything in detail, but the emotion between her lines was unmistakable. She felt cornered. She felt betrayed. And she was scared for me. My throat tightened as I turned the page. Then came a softer entry, one where she described watching me help her adjust her blankets one night at the hospital. She wrote about how gently I tucked her hair behind her ear, how I smiled even when exhausted, how she prayed I would someday learn that kindness is strength, but only when you protect it. Halfway through the journal, my phone buzzed. The sound startled me so much the journal nearly slipped from my hands. I glanced at the screen. Megan, my old coworker. I hesitated before answering, but something inside nudged me. Her voice floated through, warm and steady. She said she'd been thinking of me since Christmas. She said she missed seeing my mom's smile around the clinic. Then she asked, in the gentlest way possible, how my heart was doing. I told her the truth. I said I was in Michigan, at a cabin my mom had left for me. I said the will reading had been awful, that my dad and sister acted as if mom owed them everything. I said I felt guilty for leaving work, but also relieved that I'd been there for my mom's final months. Megan listened for a long time, without interrupting. Then she said something that made my eyes burn. Claire, the people who love you see what you did for your mom. You didn't abandon anything. You showed up. That counts more than any job ever will. I wiped my eyes and asked about the clinic. She told me something surprising. They'd been hoping I might return, even part-time. They needed someone gentle enough to make patients feel safe, but firm enough to keep things running smoothly. For a moment, hope fluttered in my ribs. The idea of returning to a life outside my family's shadow felt almost too bright. I told her I would think about it. Truly think about it. Then we said goodbye. The silence in the cabin returned, but it felt different now. Softer. Less like loneliness, and more like breathing room. I opened the journal again. The last entries were shorter, her handwriting shakier, but her words are stronger than anything she'd written before. She wrote that she was certain my dad and Lydia would fight me. She wrote that she had no illusions about their motives. She wrote that she wasn't leaving me wealth because she favored me. She was leaving protection, something they couldn't take, something I could build on. The final page held a paragraph written so carefully that the ink pooled in. Some letters. Claire, my precious girl, let your kindness lead you, but do not let anyone use it against you. You can love without surrendering yourself. You can forgive without returning to the fire. Build a life that is yours, not one shaped by fear. And do not ever again let someone hurt you the way I have watched happen too many times. I closed the journal and held it to my chest. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in a long, slow sigh. Inside, the cabin felt warmer, as if her presence lingered in the air around me. She had not just left me money or property, she had left me instructions for how to live. I placed the journal back into the box, ran my fingers along the smooth wooden lid, and whispered a thank you into the quiet room. Her last words settled into me like a seed ready to grow. Let your kindness lead you, but do not let anyone hurt you again. I sat there as the winter light faded, letting the sentence echo in the stillness until it became something steady inside me. Something like strength rising. And as the wind pressed against the cabin walls, I realized I was no longer afraid of what came next. Life did not suddenly become perfect, but the sharp edges softened. The days settled into a rhythm that felt strangely healing. I walked the wooded path behind the cabin with a thermos of coffee in the mornings. I read my mom's journal in short, quiet pieces, letting her voice come through gently instead of all at once. I spoke with Megan about returning to work, about rebuilding something steady. Slowly, my life stopped looking like debris and started looking like beginnings. A few weeks later, I knew I had to go back to Bloomington. Not to stay, just to close the door properly. The thought of that town made my stomach twist. But the version of me who had cried on that apartment floor after the funeral was not the one driving north now. This time, I had clarity and choices. My apartment building looked unchanged. Those tired beige bricks and narrow hallways smelling like cleaning solution and someone else's dinner. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. For a long moment, I just stood there. The couch where I'd read my mom's letter. The corner where grief had nearly swallowed me. It all felt smaller now, like I had grown out of it. I started packing immediately. Clothes into piles, dishes wrapped in newspaper, old photos set aside carefully. I moved steadily and without hesitation, no pausing to examine the pieces of a life that no longer fit. Late afternoon brought footsteps in the hallway. heavy, familiar. Then a knock. I already knew. I opened the door to find my dad standing there, shoulders bent as if the cold had weighed him down. Lydia beside him, arms crossed, her scarf pulled high on her neck. For a beat, we just stared at each other. His voice wavered, searching for the right tone. Lydia's eyes darted around the apartment, taking in the half-packed boxes. "Leaving for good," she said. Her voice was steadier than her expression. I stepped back and let them in. The three of us stood awkwardly in the cramped living room. My dad looked around like he had never been inside before. Maybe he hadn't. Not once in all the years I lived there. He finally said he did not want to lose his daughter. That grief made people say things they did not mean. That family should stick together. But now I heard the gaps. He did not apologize for what he said at Christmas dinner. He did not acknowledge the theft or the manipulation. He did not admit how deeply he wounded me. He wanted a reset because it was easier than taking responsibility. Then Lydia spoke. Her voice surprised me because there was something real beneath it. "I am sorry for some of the things I said," she murmured. "I was angry. I should not have taken it out on you. You were with Mom in ways the rest of us weren't. I know that." For a moment, I saw a flash of the sister I used to hope she could be. But I also saw calculation, the same survival instinct she had relied on her whole life. Now that I was the one holding the power, she wanted to be on the right side of it. I took a slow breath. I told them I did not hate them, that I cared for them in the complicated way we sometimes care for people who raised us and hurt us. I said I accepted the apologies that were true, but that did not mean everything returned to normal. My dad frowned, confused. He only understood two settings: all or nothing. I told him gently that the old normal died with Mom. The truce she held together was gone. What came next would have boundaries. I explained that Mom had made thoughtful choices in her will because she understood each of us clearly. She left him the house. She left Lydia enough to start over if she wanted. But she protected me because she knew I would be standing alone when she was gone. He opened his mouth to argue, but I raised my hand. And to my surprise, he stopped. I told them forgiveness did not mean repeating old patterns. I was choosing myself now, in a way Mom always hoped I would. Lydia's eyes filled with tears she would not let fall. She asked if I was moving to Michigan permanently. I said I did not know what forever looked like. But for now, the cabin was home, my starting point. My dad muttered that I was lucky, that not everyone had that kind of security handed to them. I thought of my mom saving $10 at a time, clipping coupons, quietly sacrificing for decades. I said nothing. Some truths were wasted on certain ears. He asked if I would stay in touch. I said I would, in time, through short calls or messages. I did not promise more than I had to give. When they turned to leave, my dad paused and put a heavy, awkward hand on my shoulder. "Take care of yourself," he said. I nodded. "You too." After they left, the apartment felt calm for the first time in years. I finished packing, returned my keys, loaded my car, and left that chapter of my life behind. Traverse City greeted me with thick snow and quiet streets. The cabin looked warm, almost welcoming. I carried the last of my things inside and felt the space take me in as if it had been waiting. The following weeks felt like thawing. I interviewed at a small family clinic Megan connected me with. They wanted someone steady, patient, and kind. I eased into the job, working a few shifts each week. The rhythm of caring for people came back naturally. Listening to their worries reminded me that life was bigger than my family's failings. On quiet days, I walked the wooded path and read more of Mom's journal. Little notes about my toddler years, scribbled recipes, prayers in the margins. It felt like stitching pieces of her back into the world. Slowly, the cabin stopped feeling like a refuge and started feeling like a beginning. One evening, after a long day at the clinic, I sat on the porch with a blanket and a mug of tea. The sky above the treetops melted from pink to purple as the sun slipped away. I thought about everything that had happened. Losing Mom, the hospital nights, Christmas dinner, my dad's cruelty, Lydia's laughter, the will, the cabin key, the emails that shattered any illusions I had left. And my mom's quiet courage is behind it all. People might say this was revenge, that my dad and sister got what they deserved. Maybe, but sitting there, in the fading light, I knew this story was not about punishing them. It was about my mom choosing me. It was about me learning to choose myself. She left me a cabin, yes, some security, a chance to breathe. But she also left something stronger. She left the truth that I was worthy of protection. She left the understanding that love does not require shrinking or begging. She left the freedom to build a life that did not orbit the people who hurt me. As the sky darkened, gratitude settled gently in my chest, not for the pain, but for the strength that rose from it. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, I want you to hear this. Silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Sometimes walking away and building something honest for yourself is stronger than any argument. If you have ever stood where I stood, choosing yourself over people who keep tearing you down, I hope my story reminds you that you are not alone. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.